Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Sobchak-Bankard, and I'm here with a rising star. No, actually, it's just PT Vignev. How's it going, PT?
I mean, pretty good. I just got word I'm the new frontrunner for visual effects. How strange. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Really excited because we have two kind of big topics for the day. But I also have with me, he's Oompa Loompa Doompity Dee. It's Greg Cass, don't you see? How's it going, Greg?
I'm sorry, I'm actually Andy Serkis performing Greg Cass tonight. But other than that, I'm good, Jen. How are you?
After you went through saying that bit was bad, then you referenced it. That's great. I love it. So if you're wondering, those were all references to the 77th EE BAFTAs, which aired in London yesterday, Sunday, February 18th. They're essentially the British equivalent of the Oscars and a pretty hefty precursor if we're trying to predict the Oscars. So we are here today to give our reactions and sort of tea leaf readings in response to that. And after that, we will review Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, which is one of the 10 Best Picture nominees at the Oscars, as well as one of the films nominated for Best International Feature. And I will say, to give a little bit of a spoiler, did really well at the BAFTAs as well. So it's all coming together. If you are listening to us for the first time, when we are talking about Zone of Interest, we will have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen the film. And with a very clear alert, we will shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. PT, if listeners think we're in their zone of interest after listening to this episode, what can they do?
Well, they can subscribe to a feed of our podcast wherever they listen. That may be their Apple Podcasts, their Spotify, their Overcast, wherever you're listening right now. Why don't you just subscribe to us? You can also follow along on Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com. That's where this show is. That's the home base for the show. And you can also follow us on social media, Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review.
Thanks, PT. So, as I mentioned, we are going to eventually get to our review of The Zone of Interest. But first, we have a fairly juicy movie news update.
Just in off the wire, it's your Hollywood news.
All right. So as I said, BAFTAs were just this weekend. Some pretty big surprises, I want to say. But before we get into those, who do we feel like were the biggest winners? Maybe those answers coincide. But who do we feel like came away from this as the biggest winners, especially in terms of gaining momentum for the Oscars?
Gaining momentum is hard. I feel like a lot of the people who had momentum already maintained their momentum, right? And that would primarily be Oppenheimer, followed by Poor Things. I don't think the power rankings in my mind really shifted there. But if we're looking at who maybe got a little boost, a little extra juice, I thought Zone of Interest grabbed a lot more attention than Anatomy of the Fall, which for my prediction sheet is what really messed me up. That I had predicted Anatomy of the Fall was really going to cruise to a lot of those categories. And is it the slight British bias, or is it, just the preference of the voters? But I think Zone of Interest pulled ahead in some of those races, or pulled closer in some of those races.
Yeah, it's funny because I thought I saw a headline or two that was like, American Fiction and Anatomy of the Fall are the night's big winners. And I was like, wait. Like Zone of Interest kind of ate Anatomy of the Fall's lunch in a couple categories. So I thought that was really interesting that people were still sort of pretty confident in Anatomy of the Fall, just because I feel like the only thing it actually won was screenplay, right? Original screenplay.
Yes.
It didn't win anything else. Yeah. So interesting that was that alone was enough to sort of make people think that it was still chugging along pretty strongly.
Well, I think the assumption is that it has locked up original screenplay. Like with this win, it's sort of, okay, it has that secured. And I think folks may have sort of shifted their expectations to that's probably the only win it's going to get, but at least it's got that, it's the heavy front runner now. I agree with Greg that the Zone of Interest really sort of made a strong showing, which we can probably unpack as the episode unfolds. I will note sort of there was a boost here for Cillian Murphy, which is maybe one of those, oh, this is a little obvious that the BAFTAs would lean towards him over Paul Giamatti. So I don't know if it's really a sea change, but at least in it's good to be the last one to win. So there's some there's a little bit of support there. Robert Downey Jr. and Da'Vine Joy Randolph seem to have secured their wins, or at least further reinforced their dominant frontrunner status. And I think the biggest boost coming out of it, especially right after the Annie Awards that had given a bunch to Across the Spider-Verse, was The Boy and the Heron taking Best Animated Feature, which really makes that feel like it's pretty close to a coin flip at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's much more of a race going on in a lot of these categories. A lot of people also speculating, Lily Gladstone was not nominated for a BAFTA, and you can sort of explain that as, well, in general, BAFTAs didn't really go for Killers of the Flower Moon because it's too American a movie. Although, see American Fiction and adapted screenplay, so I don't know what happens to that theory. Maybe they're just uncomfortable with like indigenous genocide. I don't know, but are okay with European genocide movies. So the second I started talking, I'm like, I'm gonna trip over this in some way. So apologies if that didn't come out right.
Well, the British did very little to stop the Native American genocide, whereas they're like, well, this was a genocide we helped end the in Europe in the 40s. So good job by us. They can celebrate that.
Right. But my point was, that was a very long-winded way of saying it's pretty much a neck and neck race at this point between Emma Stone and Lily Gladstone. Because Emma Stone won a BAFTA, she's like really on track staying in the race. And, depending on how SAG goes, I think I've heard lots of people say Emma Stone gets SAG, it's over, done. But if Lily Gladstone gets SAG, then she's still in it. And it's still kind of like PT was saying, like a coin toss between the two.
And we're less than a week out from SAG now, right? Like, it's shocking how much we're in the end game now. And, Jen has helpfully reminded us SAG next weekend, and that final voting starts before that, right? It starts Thursday, I think. So these wins matter a lot. I'm just going to say I'm really sad to see Lily Gladstone struggling here, because I think she's incredible in that movie. I think, actually, I think PT texted this to us. Sorry, friendship shouldn't come before content, but that, like, the fact we could be seeing another Scorsese film with double-digit nominations that walks home empty-handed, I think would be a tragedy. And I think Lily's the one who deserves it. So with all due respect to Emma Stone in a film I'm on the record for not having really appreciated, I do respect the performance. She did something pretty incredible. The physicality is there. I think Emma Stone is the real reason we're not talking about Margot Robbie anymore in that category. But
Fair.
I'd rather see it spread to somebody like Lily Gladstone, who hasn't had a shot before.
Yeah, I think this would be a much different conversation if Emma Stone didn't already have an Oscar. I think that, very few people would be like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, she's this, what a performance. She's doing great. But we've talked about this before, very similar to last year, a returning champion coming in with a newcomer, or at least newcomer to to being nominated for awards from an underrepresented community, sort of are going head to head. Last year it went to the latter. We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to see how, as of this recording, it's Monday the 19th. The final Oscar voting starts on Thursday the 22nd, as Greg said. And then we have SAG is Saturday the 24th. The Producers Guild of America Awards is the next day, the 25th. And then voting ends on Tuesday, the 27th. So this next week is like the push. This is where it's all sort of coming to a head. So yeah,
and this is a critical time where the winds can shift very quickly. And all of a sudden, somebody's winning that we didn't even think about or weren't talking about before. So, but I keep remembering this time last year at the BAFTAs, and this is where the All Quiet on the Western Front thing started. People were like, it won so many BAFTAs. What do we do now? And then it actually won so many Oscars, right? So to me, I'm kind of like, is there an equivalent here this year, is it zone of interest? Is zone of interest going to sort of bubble up to the surface in a couple? Is that going to be the spoiler in some weird category we're not seeing right now? Or I feel like it's also in the craft categories in particular. Oppenheimer sort of won the things that I thought it would win, but then Poor Things won the head-to-head battle with Barbie in a lot of the other craft categories, like production design, which people perceive to be pretty competitive at the Oscars, right? So like production design, makeup and hairstyling, which is not nominated. Barbie's not nominated at the Oscars for that, but I think people thought it had a chance here. And just like Barbie went away empty-handed at the BAFTAs, which like that I don't know how much you can explain that as British people being British, like, you know what I mean? Because based on the ceremony, they were like, yeah, we're cool, we like Barbie. Like that was in terms of the planting of the cast and like the jokes and bits in between and stuff like that. Like Barbie definitely seemed to be very present at the BAFTAs and yet went home with nothing. And so I think things are not looking good for Killers of the Flower Moon. Things are not looking good for Barbie. Things are definitely not looking good for Maestro because it couldn't even win makeup.
This is where this all starts to feel a little icky. And for me, it stands out in the BAFTAs for the stupid reason where I'm like, you made all these people fly halfway around the world to sit in your auditorium and smile and nod at your lame jokes. And look, they're billionaires. They're fine. But it's like, it's very cool to have Barbie cast members sitting in your crowd. And it's, there was a great moment where David Tennant fulfilled my Doctor Who dreams of talking to Carey Mulligan and said, can you introduce me to your posh friend? And Bradley Cooper was the posh friend. And it was all charming and it was really exciting to see, but it just starts to feel exploitative in a way where it's like, these people have no chance at these awards, but we're going to invite them to get whatever gains we could. And I have to be on brand, and I don't think there's a sound cue for me on this one, but we'll see. But now I'm nervous. But I would say the most the moment of the night where they were like the British people being British, I think is how much focus there was on Saltburn, which everything else has forgotten. Yeah. But
I don't have a sound drop for that.
They're the only ones who got a musical performance. Rosamund Pike got a nice little moment back and forth. And then there were multiple jokes built around Saltburn. And, I think I'm not here to say Saltburn should be involved in the Oscars, but it just felt like almost like we were seeing across meme cultures. It's like, oh, they're still talking about Saltburn over there, whereas we're still talking about Barbie or something. I'm not sure.
I think that is interesting that it's still lingering, or is that just that they wrote all the jokes like 3 weeks ago when it was still up at the top of all the letterbox lists and they never got around to revising it. I do think in the craft categories, it will be interesting to see if success here translates a success for Poor Things below the line translates into the Oscars. It seems possible. It is also interesting that, these are, these didn't go to Oppenheimer, like, which again, it's sort of, it feels very possible. And maybe this is just me sort of projecting forward. Like I could see such an Oppenheimer push that all these sort of, is it going to Barbie or Poor Things? They actually go to Oppenheimer and Oppenheimer ends up with like 8 or 9 wins. But it does seem to shake that kind of, oh, well, yeah, this makes sense. Barbie would get production and it would get costumes. And, maybe there's just going to be Barbie gets song and that's where it is. And it gets to enjoy that. And we'll move on. We'll move on from there. It also, and I did sort of reference it earlier. It is also fun that Poor Things won visual effects, which I think makes sense, except it's not nominated for the Oscars. So everyone is like, we have no idea who's going to win at the Oscars. There's no precursors are directing us. There's no Avatar this year that's going to lead us into an easy pick. So folks are a little bit lost there. I will say there is something that like always feels enjoyably, but maybe it's not fair, but like infantilizing for all the voters, where it's just like, what's the most recent thing you saw? I saw the BAFTAs. I will vote like the BAFTAs. And like, I do think there is influence, and people talk about how, oh yeah, like I saw this person on stage and it felt good that they won, or they said something, it bothered me, I went in a different direction, whatever. But it is so fun that it's like, there's like very little object permanence, it seems, in the minds of Academy voters. Like the sort of standard replacement Academy voter comes across as very simple when the game theorizing is happening about how they're going to vote.
Well, and so to Jen's question, if there is a All Quiet on the Western Front, I might make a case that it's Holdovers, because Holdovers did pretty well, not just with Davine. Now, Paul Giamatti did lose, but Best Casting got thrown to Holdovers, which is,
right.
we don't yet have an Oscars for. But for another movie that feels kind of fully American in its storytelling and disposition, I mean, private schools, Britain gets that. That's like their thing. But, it does feel like, oh, I was surprised to see that kind of resonate so well. And then to pick up on your point, PT, I thought Davine nailed the speech. So if I'm the simpleton Academy voter and I saw Davine, it's not like there's any doubt about her at this point, but it's like, I want to see her do that again, and I want to feel good giving her the top prize.
It was so good. And then PT, because I know you didn't see the broadcast, Alexander Payne walking her down the stairs holding her dress. The whole thing from start to finish was magic. It was just like, I was like, I need this at the Oscars. Like, this looks incredible. And then she's like, flirting with, I can never remember how to pronounce his name correctly.
Chiwetel Ejiofor. Yeah.
Thank you. He took it very well. He blushed very elegantly. It was great. She was amazing, and such a good example, because she's had to give so many speeches by this point. Mm-hmm. She's won so many things that's the sign of a good Oscars campaign, is that whoever's coaching her or helping her at all, if anyone, with her speeches, they're like, you got to hold back. Like, you got to pace yourself and work your way up to the Oscars speech. And I thought this was really well timed, where I'm like, yes, like this is what I've been kind of waiting for in the final push. So that was great to see. I think, that race is pretty much sewn up. I don't think there's much that would like jeopardize her win at this point.
I think that the only other category I want to sort of mention here, to your initial question, Jen, of where are there potential upsets, I don't know if like we may not consider an upset, but I bet for a lot of people it might be. Zone of interest winning in sound. That feels like a category that most people would go into the Oscars assuming that's one of the ones Oppenheimer will clean up on, because there's so much sound happening in that movie. But as we will get into and discuss, and I'm not intentionally, but maybe I am setting up the segue into talking about the movie, it's so important to it. And I could see that being, yep, that's a BAFTA. It's a British movie. It won Outstanding British Picture here. That being the craft category it wins at the BAFTAs is very nice, but that's very British, and that's where it happens. But I could see it winning in the actual Oscars, and that being something that folks who haven't seen this movie and don't know about it, maybe folks listening who aren't planning to stay around for the spoiler section, might be like, huh? When it makes all the sense of the world, I think, when you've seen the movie.
And the sound designer has been campaigning. I've seen him popping up in lots of places. So, and I can't remember. I think his last name is Bird. Does anyone have that info? Probably not.
Johnny Byrne and Tarn Willers.
Okay. Thank you. Johnny Byrne was who I was thinking of. I think that's the name I've heard a bunch of times. So, okay. That was a beautiful set for a segue, but I'm just going to completely spike it in the other direction, because I don't want to leave this discussion without talking about American Fiction, because to me, that was the biggest surprise. Like, Gold Derby had that dead last. And that's, and I, in my rush, was just like, yeah, sure, whatever, I'll rank it last. I don't think it has a chance in this category because it's American, and it's sort of like, this category is so stacked and so crowded, it's not going to have, how could it go up against all these other big films? But it won, and I feel like Cord Jefferson gave a pretty good speech, and I feel like I was listening to Next Best Picture. I only caught like the beginning of their episode earlier today, but they were like, Matt Naglia was basically like, I think this is done now. Like he's predicting American Fiction to win the Oscars for adapted screenplay, which I was like, oh, like that's, I don't know if I would have gone that far, but what do we think? Like, is this how huge is this for American Fiction in adapted screenplay at the Oscars?
I think this is so well deserved. I think it's a huge deal that it beat out Zone of Interest in this award show where kind of Zone of Interest was overperforming. And Zone of Interest is a really kind of different kind of adaptation. It's not a straight adaptation, right? It's very much a zag from the book, but the book is written by a great British novelist, Martin Amis. So like that all should be wind in the sails. And so for everything you just said, and then add that on, I think it's a huge win. But there's one problem. I love this movie. I love Cord Jefferson. I love that his pedigree is Mike Schur teaching him how to write on Parks and Rec and The Good Place and everything. Listen to the episode. I gushed a whole bunch. But the problem is Greta Gerwig and that she didn't get a Best Picture nomination, right? And so the fact that she's in that category, and that's the only way for, I believe PT said, the simpletons who can vote on the Oscars, right? These fools with their heads inside of cardboard boxes, they can't find their way anywhere else. But honestly, I think they are going to make the calculation of Greta Gerwig deserves recognition. The way the snub narrative took off, I just think it's going to take a lot to not give that to Greta Gerwig, to recognize all of Barbie, not just that. But that's me, and I don't read prognosticator websites, so maybe you all have greater insights.
I don't have greater insights. That does feel like the great unknown, because for so many of these other awards, Barbie has been in original screenplay where
right,
that's what
it hasn't been competing against these other films. Yeah,
right. And so, I guess the note is Barbie hasn't been winning original screenplay in in all. I think it won Critics' Choice, maybe
Critics' Choice, yeah.
But it didn't win here to Anatomy of a Fall. So that may be a slight indication of weakness, but that also could be BAFTA being BAFTA. But yeah, I think it's probably too far to say that it's locked up, but I had kind of assumed the Oppenheimer wave was going to build up and it was going to be like, actually, Nolan's going to slide in as the favorite the closer we get, but hasn't really been winning that. So it seems like American Fiction with Barbie being there. I will note and will open myself to Greg's justified and understandable ire that we're coming off the All of Us Strangers episode where I said I would probably replace American Fiction with All of Us Strangers in adapted screenplay, despite loving American Fiction. But more fool me, for not only did All of Us Strangers lose the BAFTA, but it also lost to the movie that I said it could replace.
The Oscars fairy smote you. It was great.
You live by the Oscar fairy, you die by the Oscar fairy. And it was, but no, I mean, I think that would be great. And I feel like, because both Jeffrey Wright and Sterling K. Brown don't seem like they are going to be spoilers in their respective categories, it would be great for American Fiction to win something, and that would be fun if it were screenplay. Though I think Greg makes a really strong point that there may be a pull among voters to sort of be like, oh my god, like, well, Greta should have gotten director, and since she couldn't be. She wasn't nominated for director, where I wouldn't have voted for her. I will vote for her in screenplay, and then she gets a win, and that's fun too. Like, that would be great.
All right, so we've ruined PT's wonderful segue that he had for us to switch to Zone of Interest. But again, here we go. Here's my transition. Zone of Interest, we mentioned overperformed. I think we didn't specifically mention it beat Poor Things for Best British Film.
Yes,
and that was the one I was expecting it to get. So Poor Things, interesting coming out of BAFTAs, because on the one hand it was stronger in craft categories, on the other hand I would have thought that it would have gotten Best British Film if it really is in second place in the overall award season race, you know what I mean? Because a lot of people think it's right behind Oppenheimer. This makes me not so sure, and I'm like, can Zone of Interest kind of sneak in there and snipe some of its categories? But yeah, the fact that Zone of Interest got Best British Film and it also got the non-English language film.
Yes.
Yep.
It got best film not in the English language and outstanding British film. A wonderful contradiction. And then best sound.
Which I believe the acceptance speech commented on. I think they were like, they pointed at because it's a co-production between the UK and Poland, I want to say. So,
yes.
Right. So they sort of made fun of that. They were like pointed to the one producer being like best non-English language film, best British film. Like it was pretty funny.
That's funny. Yeah, I will say, I think to further ruin your attempted segue, which I keep ruining it, I think the real big winner, and this is boring to say, but it was Oppenheimer. It has no real challenger. It doesn't have a main main person. Like, again, like The Holdovers got a little bit, The Poor Things got a little bit, Zone of Interest got a little bit, Anatomy of a Fall got something, American Fiction got something, but no one got momentum towards like toppling the big favorite. So Oppenheimer is still sort of slow and steady winning the race up at director and picture.
So you're saying Oppenheimer has become the destroyer of worlds? Is that what you're saying? All right, let's go make
He has become Oscar. He has become Oscar destroyer of campaigns.
Oh, the Oscar Prometheus. Oh man. We don't need to go on because there's going to be so much more to talk about after SAG and PGA next weekend.
I just wanted to shout out Rye Lane was an awesome movie, and it got a very small release on streaming, and it got a lot of love at the BAFTAs in terms of nominations. People should check that out because, you know, I love talking about the horse race, but there were some sprinkles in here of really good films that I think people miss. So last I knew, Rye Lane was on Hulu, and it's like it's before sunset if it's, you know, people in South London. It's really fun. It's great. So
I've almost watched it several times, but now I'm like, after watching the little clips at BAFTAs, I'm like, why did I sleep on this movie? I need to go back and watch it. So,
Greg, where are you on The Old Oak?
The Old Oak?
One of the other outstanding British films. You know, The Old Oak.
I don't know if that's come out
in America.
The other one that was really crazy is I saw the best animated shorts in the theater, and because the shorts are so short, they threw in 2 bonus shorts, one of which was called Wild Summon, which is basically it's animated, but it's like a nature documentary about salmon spawning, except the salmon are little human beings with like snorkels and masks and weirdly oversized mouths. And then they're like, here's some, you know, salmon that get caught by bears, except it's like little human beings getting ripped apart by bears. It is wild. And so it was my vote for best British short, and it failed. It lost to, I think, maybe Lobster and something. So it didn't
that
win
sounds
out,
right.
but enjoy that one. Don't leave after the 5 shorts play at your local theater. Stay for the bonus content.
Stay for the humanoid salmon. Love it. We are now ready to start talking about the Zone of Interest. We're going to share our short takes. So everybody, what was your general reaction to the Zone of Interest? A really uplifting movie.
My short take reaction is we had not extended, but a multiple text threads and a conversation before we started about how we shouldn't do any of our usual bits or jokes about the Zone of Interest at the start of this episode. So we shifted it all to the BAFTAs to avoid anything that felt like it was hawing around this movie. I think it's really well done. I think it's really important, which makes it sound like homework, but it's really rough and really tough to watch. But it may be the movie I've been thinking about the most since I saw it, like at this point, quite a few weeks ago. And it just hasn't really left my mind. So that's my short take on it.
How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I agree with what PT's saying. It's very hard to say how you feel about this film without falling into a cliche of it's really important or it is your duty to see this film. And I think that does it a disservice because it's ultimately like hugely inventive and an incredible way to give you a really serious message. So I'll return to what my Letterboxd review was when I saw it back in mid-January. And what I said is, you know, I think it's clear people have heard the premise of this film, that this is a film about the family of the commandant of Auschwitz and the life they lead directly next to the wall of the concentration camp. And so if you go in knowing that premise, it is exactly what you think it will be, and yet so much more than that. It is kind of overwhelming and enveloping in this way that is so carefully constructed and yet so kind of miraculous. And like it's like it could, you can't imagine human minds coming up with a way to deliver this message so well. So so back to the cliches, it is a tough watch, right? There are very few movies in my mind that I recall ever watching and saying, I absolutely loved every frame of that and I will never watch it again. And this is now the prime example of that returning to this seems like something I don't have the strength to do, but I am so very grateful that I watched it the one time. Follow that up, Jen, and don't use cliches.
Well, so I'm just gonna say that this film is absolutely brilliant. And the thing I didn't expect, because just knowing the premise and knowing that the big deal about this was that it never shows any of the violence or atrocities that occurred in Auschwitz. It only is showing the sort of everyday, mundane domestic life of this family right next door. And so you kind of see hints and implications of it, and that's actually much, in some ways, like more horrifying or upsetting or gut-wrenching than if we had sort of a very graphic and gory portrayal of what's happening on the other side of the wall. And so I think from that, I kind of knew that was what I was getting into going into it. The thing I didn't expect was that from a purely formalist perspective, this film is immaculate. Like it is shot perfectly. Everything from I feel like every frame is perfectly composed, both in terms of, like, I noticed so much like symmetry and kind of things in the foreground and the background, and also just from a production design perspective, where like there's so much attention to detail. Everything you can tell is positioned and placed with purpose. Even like tiny little objects and stuff, like, you know what I mean? Like, and the editing. So everything that like makes this a film, right? Everything that from a film form perspective for me, I was like totally blown away by. And I was just like, I cannot believe how staggeringly beautiful and yet utterly horrifying everything I'm seeing and hearing is. And so it's that weird combination of like the precision filmmaking with and like, and all the shots are sort of set from this like weird, like a really unusual height where it's almost like waist level. And the big thing I sort of heard about this was that it sort of has a Big Brother setup where like the camera is often sort of tucked away and there's like, laundry hanging in the foreground in a way that blocks seeing what the characters are doing, right? There's so many choices in this that are so smart for what it's trying to show. That was the thing that I was sort of like really like I kind of knew all the other stuff, like all of the Holocaust content I was like preparing myself for, but I was not prepared for this from like a film student nerd sort of perspective. Like this feels like a film that's going to get used in film classes, in a good way.
It seems like every major, especially like white dude, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, a filmmaker name checks Stanley Kubrick, and I think of like Christopher Nolan and David Fincher particularly, are sort of like, oh, like Kubrick are huge influence, and they both had movies that came out to varying degrees of awards nomination success. But this is the first movie I feel like I've ever seen that was like, if you told me Stanley Kubrick directed this, I would believe it. Even more so than Spielberg's AI, which was developed with Kubrick and blah, blah, blah. It still felt like a Spielberg movie, but everything that you're saying, Jen, it was like, oh yeah, like this has that, like it's detached, but in a way that like somehow draws you in closer. Like it makes you sort of lean in to everything that's happening and pay more attention to every part of the frame. And yeah, feel like some weird combination of voyeur, but also like it's part of a surveillance state that you're monitoring what's happening here. That felt so thematically resonant with the movie, while also just on a pure cinema level being, this weird sort of like pleasurable. It's weird to describe the movie that way. For like, as Greg said, it's hard to think about leaving and being like can't wait to tuck back in to this one. But like I actually like could see myself watching it again because of like all these formalist choices that work together so well.
And like I hate using the word beautiful to describe this film, and yet like that's sort of what I find myself doing, and it feels really weird.
Well, that's part of the project, right? Is that you have to get sucked into this world and you have to be a part of that. I was just going to say, I've heard a few critics in describing this say that, part of why it's such a struggle to talk about is it almost becomes a piece of like performance art or visual art instead of, really a narrative film of any kind. The story that is present doesn't matter at all. And we are, staying spoiler free, but there are a lot of really unexpected formalist choices, and it kind of starts the minute you sit down. I'll spoil the opening, which is the film starts with a very long kind of soundscape overture, which is more tonal than musical, I think, as I recall it. And it's this weird kind of hyperbaric chamber. I think that's the right thing, right? That's where scuba divers get into their submarines, right? And it's weird that you need this way in which it kind of changes the pressure around you and makes you then able to enter into the world of this film. And it ends roughly the same way. I guess I'm not going to spoil anything, just the last shot of the film. But there's this catch and release quality to that, and that doesn't spoil anything. But the way it becomes this intense experience you have in the theater is just supported in these ways that I think PT is right to call them Kubrickian. And Jen, you're right to say like it's so specific, and they clearly got exactly what they wanted and didn't leave anything to chance. And it's pretty incredible. I will say there were some walkouts in my theater, and when people walked out, I was like, don't blame you at all, because it is intense. And so as we reference our kind of short takes, I think it's only fair that people be aware that this is not a light undertaking, even though it's totally worth it, I think, by all three of our own evaluations.
I think that's a great indicator. We should move to the recommendation algorithm, in which we establish the audience of a film, ? Who's walking out of this movie, right? In general, we always acknowledge this film. Not every film is for everyone, and so we try to figure out like who's going to be but this one is the biggest challenge we've probably had yet, because of exactly what Greg was talking about in terms of like the subject matter is so tough. Would you even like, barring the everyone should watch this movie, right, which is something we also said about Killers of the Flower Moon, right, in terms of it's an important movie to see, but are we actually recommending it to anyone?
Yeah, it's hard because I responded to and agreed with what Greg just said about like, I don't blame anyone who walks out, but just in thinking about it as you set up this segment, Jen, I guess if there's anyone who's just sort of like, this is too like draining and difficult because of the genocide aspect, the inhumanity that's on display in the movie, and the knowledge that you come into it with about history, however much or little, I think everyone has enough basic knowledge to understand the context of what's going on. Like I get it. Like I think that's the sort of like, yes, like you should be absolved of the requirement of watching this movie if you are just like not able to emotionally prepare for it. But I could also see people being like, I find this boring. I'm not interested in what's happening in this household. And I feel like those people, it's like, just shut up and sit down. Like you need to pay attention. And that's sort of a like, take your medicine, which again is not, you take your medicine, do your homework, eat your vegetables, which is not the most fun thing to say. And like, that's hard to recommend. But I do think that if it sounds like this movie might be drab and boring and a little bit like, yeah, I get it. Like maybe this is like a 10-minute short film. I don't need whatever, an hour and 50 minutes of it. I think you do. And I think that it's something that it's actually really worth your time, and it's worth it to see, to see how it unfolds. And this is maybe broaching back to the short take slightly, but I have also seen and heard some of the critics that Greg referenced who are kind of like, what? There's no narrative. Like, what's the story? There's also like, is there a character arc? Like, is anyone actually like changing and growing and learning, or are we just seeing, it's so quotidian, it's so mundane that like, I don't know, like what are we doing here? I almost feel like we as the audience are the protagonists of it, and we are the ones who are changing and evolving as the movie unfolds. Like the audience are the ones whose journey we should be tracing. And so in that sense, yeah, it's weird to say like I recommend everyone do it if they think they can handle it. I recommend everyone go through this process, which is not a great way to recommend a movie by calling it a process. But yeah.
I mean, I think this movie gets as close as we can to answering the question of like, how could something like the Holocaust have happened? You know what I mean? Like, and I feel like historians or, even like history students, maybe is what I should say, often, when they first start learning about what happened and stuff like that, ask that question. We're like, how could this have happened? Like, this is just so confounding from a human perspective. Like, how could humanity have let this happen? Right. And I feel like this film does such a good job of illustrating exactly how it happened. You know what I mean? Like, to be like, these are the conditions in which this was able to occur. Right. These are the exact people who were facilitating this whole thing and who were benefiting from it. And we get to see their everyday life. So,
I honestly have been thinking a lot about my wife, just daydreaming about her. No, because, she's somebody who has a strong interest in history, has seen a lot of Holocaust, reads a lot of Holocaust narratives. We are blessed to be here in Boston. So Elie Wiesel was just around a lot and you could see him at public events a lot. And I can't imagine forcing her to watch this. And it's really interesting. She was the person who showed me Schindler's List, just, to have a point of comparison. And the intensity of this is so different than that film, even though I would describe both as incredibly intense. So to PT's language of like, I would not disrespect anybody who couldn't handle it. And, I'm certainly, I think my wife has heard what the premise is, learned all about it. Again, we're parents of young children, so it's hard to be like, oh, you're one night out this week. Why don't you go grab a seat to that film? But at the same time, I think I would never. I don't give any disrespect to people who say that's not for me. So I did see it at like a 2:00 matinee on Boston Common, and it was primarily older folks with me. I would say I was probably the youngest. Sometimes at that theater, you get the cool Emerson College film students who are there for awards movies. And I think they were still on spring break. And so it felt to me, and this is me stereotyping, that it was a lot of kind of elderly couples who had like taken the drive into the city because they were seeking this out and felt that it was important and major. And I assume some people in the room were of the Jewish faith. I am not, just since this is audio and that's not established anywhere or anything. And so I felt like as people left that it was like they felt like they took as much as they could handle and that they weren't dissatisfied with the experience, but they just felt like they couldn't take any more. And so that makes me hesitate to recommend it. But, if this is an area of interest, one thing we haven't said is I think there's a clear resonant message to the present day, and not just connected to the rise in anti-Semitism that has unfortunately come back in the last decade or so. But it's something important in that way too. And among like my reactions is also kind of a charge to be mindful, because the film demonstrates that it's pretty easy to be the people over the wall, right? And so you want to make it your mission not to be that. So yeah, will this like burn up the charts on Netflix? I don't think so, and I don't think it should. But the last concern I'll say is just like I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from seeing this who just have no interest for gross, terrible reasons, and that's a shame because I think this film could make a big difference in the lives of some.
This does feel like a film that could end up as a part of high school curriculum. You know what I mean? Like as the Holocaust movie I can't remember what movie we watched. I remember watching lots of Civil War movies in my in middle school and high school, but not. I can't remember if we watched Schindler's List. That's probably the one that we would have, though, right? Like,
you didn't watch Glory over and over because it's like
we
Massachusetts. Let's go.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We watched Glory and the Blue and the Gray is the other one, right?
Yeah, the TV movie. Yeah.
So we like I have distinct memories of watching those films as a part of history class. Yeah, so like that would be the way that people are. I don't want to use the word forced, but have the opportunity to watch this where they wouldn't otherwise opt in is at school. So like, there's that, and like I think I was listening to a podcast where someone pointed out that because this is not graphic, that it's actually more likely to get shown in a school,
right?
Because it's like because the rating is not like R. You know what I mean? Like it's like while it's horrifying in every frame, it's horrifying for not the reasons that things get banned from schools or like for being inappropriate, for violence and stuff like that. I don't know did we actually figure anything out during that? I don't know.
Well,
maybe we should just go to spoiler mode.
The teacher and me would love to be able to roll in the old AV cart and put that's how we show movies now. But put this on like without context.
Do you have it in microfiche, Greg? Is that what you're asking?
Where's your overhead markers?
Maybe this is rhetorical situation content, but I will say it really just feels like if you walked into this blind, it would be incredible, right? The fact that from the opening frame, I'm sitting there saying like, oh my God, these people are monstrous and I know exactly who they are and what's going on kind of ruins the effect of the film itself. And, I don't know if it was the marketing or film discourse that kind of spoiled it to me. But to your point, Jen, if this was a history class and you just let the high schoolers kind of see this normal, boring life and let them put those clues together as it unfolded, I think that would be mind-blowing and far superior, with no disrespect to Master Spielberg, than doing the permission slips to get everybody to watch Schindler's List. So
now we are only probably a couple of years away from The Day the Clown Cried being widely available. So that may change. That may change our calculus on this.
Is it bad that I don't know what that is? Like what?
That's the Jerry Lewis movie that he made that was about being a clown in a concentration camp. That when he finished it, he hated it so much he locked it away, and he said it could only be shown publicly so many years after his death, and we're a couple of years away from that.
Wow. Okay.
So it's supposed to be just wildly tonally off and just like a huge swing that like isn't maybe that dissimilar from like A Life is Beautiful, which of course a lot of people really loved and was very successful, but like he finished making it, he put a bunch of money into it and was just like, this is a disaster, no one can ever see this while I'm alive. I was trying to inject some levity, but I only created confusion.
I'm glad you bring up Life is Beautiful because this is sort of the opposite in terms of type of Holocaust movie. Because at least Life is Beautiful, I think, did as well as it did because it had the warm, heartfelt father-son relationship at the center of it, right? And then it was like it's surrounded by the horrors of the Holocaust. It's like the family that we're watching. They're a fairly normal family from a lot of perspectives. But when you think about who they are and what they're doing and why they are where they are, then they become like there's so little that you feel for them that it's kind of the opposite experience of Life is Beautiful. So, but that doesn't mean it's not as effective as telling the story of the Holocaust for sure.
So we're recommending it to everyone except the people who don't think they can watch it. Is that where we landed?
We're posing the challenge. Can you handle this movie? Maybe you can't, but maybe that's going to motivate you to be like, challenge accepted. I'm going to go watch this.
Can you handle it.com on the little the postcards they hand out.
Yes. Okay. So I think we're more than ready to go into spoiler mode. I think it's been actually pretty hard to talk about this without actually spoiling it, because I do agree with Greg. There were a couple of things in this film that I was genuinely shocked by, and not just from like a shocked, like horrified by, but like surprised that the film turned this way or like did this. And so I want to talk about those things. So we are going to go into spoiler mode. If you have not seen The Zone of Interest and our resounding recommendation is not driving you away naturally, go really go see it. It's especially if you have an appreciation for film and art and what it can do with history. Like, it is just a mind-blowing experience, I think. An upsetting one, but a mind-blowing one. And so, if you haven't seen the film and you don't want it spoiled, we are now going to go into spoiler mode now. Okay.
Feels too peppy for.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Like, this is.
But I don't know what you can do. I mean, it is what it is.
Know. It's our spoiler mode music. What to you was the most surprising thing in this film, or the moment where you were just like, "Whoa, I did not see that coming"?
To me, the most surprising thing was that this wasn't a story about people in denial. This was a story about people who their eyes were wide open and they had no problem with what was happening. Like, that's what I assumed. And I don't know if that's directly what Craig meant in his Letterboxd review, but that's like that. Your Letterboxd review, like, crystallized like that thought in my mind of like, oh, I knew the outline. I knew what I was getting into, I thought, but it was like, oh, this is actually like heavier and darker because these people are not like, what? Like, I don't hear that. Like, I don't know what's going on, but they're just sort of like, yeah, cool. Like, that's great. Like, we're in on this completely. And then there are some characters who get like, the mother, mother/mother-in-law, depending on your perspective, who shows up, the grandmother, to add a third relationship, who is a little bit more like unaware, and when she faces what's happening, like, freaks out and has to leave. But yeah, that was the thing. And the line, Sandra Hewler's line when she's mad about the mom leaving and says something about like, I'll get my husband to turn you into ash, to one of the Jewish slaves working in the house. Yeah. That's when it was just like, oh my God. Like, she knows everything. Like, she knows all that's happening. I'm the one who wanted to project onto them that's kind of what I was thinking about the journey. Like, I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. I wanted it to be the story of someone who was learning and unraveling and maybe starting to feel guilty, but there's no guilt and there's no remorse and there's no change because they're just completely dehumanized these other people in the world.
And I think that grandmother figure, when she comes to visit, is so important because it shows like a huge differential, right? Because it's like, she, as someone who hasn't lived there a long time, is not physically used to anything. Like, the smoke really bothers her, seeing the bright lights from the fires, hearing the gunfire, all of these things that for a normal person would be very disturbing, unsettling, making you physically ill. Everyone else around her is just like, no problem. Like, this is not affecting us at all. And so the fact that they are so comfortable and so used to this environment, when it's so very clearly, and not even that, but like talking about that it's like this idyllic dream place that they've always wanted to live. Crazy. Like, so, because they feel like the Sandra Hüller character, whose name I'm not remembering right now, the commandant's wife, like she, Hedwig, that's her name.
Hedwig,
right? Yeah, Hedwig, which I'm just like, staying on Harry Potter. Like, why are we like? I was offended by that. But she says, like, this is what we've always dreamed, the dream that we've always been building towards. Our children are healthy and happy and strong, and like, why would we ever leave here? And it's just like, oh my gosh, it's insane. Like that. Like, you're scrubbing your children down because you think that they just swam in a river with dead bodies. Like, I don't know. Like, what? Yeah.
I'm going to say, I don't think it's because it was dead bodies. I think it was because they might have touched Jewish blood.
Oh.
That was my read on it.
They
didn't care about the skeletons or the skulls. It was unclean people.
Greg, did you pick up on that? I feel really bad for not picking up on that.
I didn't interpret it that way, but I have nothing but like, yeah, that makes more sense. So I have no rebuttal to it, and nor do I want one, because I think it's right. And I want to just emphasize, agreeing with PT, the children too, right? I mean, there's a scene very early where the kids, the two boys, I believe, are laying in bed and they're swapping gold teeth that have been pried from the victims and given to the children. And it's this kind of innocent childhood moment that is absurdly horrifying. And that you're just taken into this world where this is the commonplace. And the other very early scene is just this kind of distribution of some clothes, and the way Sandra Hüller's character just tries on a fur coat and is just modeling it and thinking about it, and even uses the lipstick in the pocket. And it's like, you're familiar with that type of scene because it's like, oh, it's a domestic housewife dreaming of a life of glamour that she's denied. And then you're like, no, it's so different than that and so much more horrifying. And I think the film is very deliberate about giving you familiar scenes. And Jen, your point about the Big Brother camera work is that too, right? It's like we're used to that kind of indulgent voyeuristic behavior in reality TV culture. And it's like, you're a part of this, you're guilty too. And it's really unsettling. And part of its oppressiveness is that it's kind of unrelenting in that way. And you don't get any kind of break from feeling like, yeah, like this could easily be me, or, my sympathies. There were times I honestly, we're being honest here, felt myself rooting. Like, I hope he gets that big promotion. He's sure working hard. And I'm like, no, what are you doing? Like, that's unacceptable. Like, you can't, but it's such a clever way to mess with us using the kind of structures of narrative, right? And I always think Dan Harmon has a great essay on the hero's journey and story structure, and he's like, all you have to do is name a character and our sympathies are instantly with them. And this movie like pushes that to the extreme. Like, it's actually hard to break our sympathies off these characters, even though we see every moment how monstrous they are. But it's like you're accustomed to putting yourself into them and kind of rooting for those characters, even though you very much are not on their side very quickly. It's really tough. It's cognitive dissonance at its absolute most powerful, because it's really trying to help you question everything that you've seen before. Jen, what were some moments that you felt, well, let me rephrase your question. What are some moments that are going to stick with you, that you're really like, PT said it, that, this movie is the movie that has stuck in his mind the most, or he's thought the most about? Any particular moments that are that for you?
So I don't want to zoom us too far ahead and talk about the ending, but one of them is the ending in terms of like the intercutting between the past and the present. I was just like, that was one of the things I really did not see coming. But in terms of moments that will stick with me, I sort of wish I hadn't listened to critics talking about this movie, because all of them talked about the fur coat scene, and so that one actually I was sort of desensitized to, because I knew, and is it in the trailer? I can't remember now. So like I knew too much about that going in, and was like therefore sort of slightly less surprised and horrified. But I feel like there's one sequence where the commandant is locking up for the night, and it's so long. Like, he's going back and forth, closing this door, going back this way, closing this door, and then he sort of like systematically works his way up to upstairs because he's going to bed. And first of all, I kept being like, why are there so many doors? Like, what is happening right now? And I was like, oh, I guess it's maybe for security reasons, like in case someone escapes from the camp, and like they need to lock down or something like that to make like a chambered system. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is mirroring the crematorium blueprints, which we had seen like a couple scenes before. I'm like, or a gas chamber. Like, it's like the chambered nature of the home. And there's so many shots that instigate from that front door, and then like we quickly cut to another room when someone enters another room. And so those are that like sequences like that, I think, are what it really, which seems weird because like, I could easily say the teeth, right? The bones in the river, the girl at night planting, like there's so many I could list that are like just like upsetting, but I think it's sequences like that that are really going to stick with me the most, because it's because it like really just forces you to sit with it. You know what I mean? To be like, oh, this is someone living their everyday life, and yet it is such a crazy circumstance that they are wholly accepting of. I don't know if that was a good answer to your question, but what about you two? Like, what are things that are going to stick with you?
I will say, in addition to some of the that moment, some of the moments that we've already talked about, the again, like mother-in-law character. There's sort of two kind of mirror moments with her. One is, she's arrived, she's being shown around the garden, and is just like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And then, she says something about kind of like, oh, like my old boss could be like over there. Like, do you think like that lady, like she was always like, she always sucked. Like, and like there was this kind of like, oh, like aren't we on top now? And like it kind of tapped into that little bit of like victory dance component to it. And again, that was another moment, because like Greg said, the thing with the teeth, that's in the first, like, it's certainly the first 10 minutes of action. We can talk about the overture moment, but I feel like it's the first 10 minutes of the whole movie. There's not a lot of time apart from what I brought into the theater. There was not a lot of feigning that there was confusion within this family. But yeah, the grandmother showing up and sort of almost like crowing about a Jewish woman that she knew and used to work for, right, and how she may finally have been laid low. But then contrasting that with when she's faced in the night with the glow of the furnace, the sort of hellish projection onto it, and then that she gets that sort of photo negative night vision, which has only been the one of the Jewish servants like going out and trying to do something positive and helpful for the workers and planning food around. But we see that grandmother like scrambling to get all of her clothes so she can pack up and leave because she's so horrified at the sight of what she's actually confronting what's happening. Mm-hmm. So the contrast of those two moments has stuck with me.
You also reminded me of the boots, the washing of the boots. Mm-hmm. That's pretty early in the film too, where I was just like, oh no, like they're washing the boots for him because they're covered in blood. Mm-hmm. And it's like no big deal.
Gotta clean them.
And they don't make anyone else take their shoes off, but then he takes his boots off and I'm like, oh, that's weird. And then I'm like, oh, that's why. Okay. But yeah, what about you, Greg?
Two that haven't been mentioned. The domestic staff, I think, are a major source of that kind of the horrifying nature of it all, because you recognize that these individuals are doing all they can to avoid their fate, mm-hmm, and are just suffering this family through. The gardener, in the image of the gardener spreading the ashes, kind of, I believe they're under rose bushes even, which is kind of something that should be too on the nose, but is just like, it was one of those moments for me where it was like, it's everything. Like anything beautiful in a frame on this is the product of this hatred and this genocide. And, I think there is a shot where he finds some teeth or what have you in there, but, it's horrifying. And then the other one, and it's really, I can't necessarily pinpoint why this has stuck with me so much, but I think a lot about the woman who appears to be essentially the sexually abused prisoner that the commander keeps as his plaything, right, and is having an affair with, and particularly she, he's on I believe on a phone call, and she enters and clearly is just doing all the motions to prepare herself for their encounter. And one of the last steps is like this hair toss, like this very dramatic, like, mm-hmm, throw all her hair back behind her. And there's something about that, like, having to beautify yourself for the man who's about to rape you, which is the only way you don't get to stay out of the ovens, is just like so incredibly horrifying to me, and kind of has stuck in my head. And it's literally the hair flip, because it's like at that most minute level, the monster's going to make you also look alluring, right? Like that just to me has, and that's all we see of that woman really, but it's just like so horrifying. So
for me, it was like the extent to which he has to clean himself afterwards.
Yes.
I feel like that they really linger on that and
ritualize.
make you like sit with it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like there's like a whole system he has set up with like the towels, like the clean towels and the dirty towels, and like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it was terrible.
Ugh.
So yeah.
I can't imagine why someone wouldn't want to see this movie.
I know. But at the same time, it's like really fascinating because there is a little bit of suspense, I find, in terms of like, because it took me a minute to, all the things we've been talking about took me a minute to figure out, you know what I mean, to be like, wait, what is this? Oh no, like, you know what I mean, like that continued throughout the movie where I kept being like, this is bizarre, and then when you put it together, it's just like totally horrifying. So okay, so there are other things that I feel like are somewhat ambiguous in terms of the film, or like we can kind of interpret in different ways or unpack. One of them, and this is what I alluded to earlier, the most surprising moment where I just was like flabbergasted that this cut happened, was when the commandant, like, he's been partying, he calls Hedwig, she doesn't care at all, and is like, why are you waking me up? And then he starts like dry heaving on the stairwell, and then he looks to the side, and then the film cuts to what I assume is a museum in Auschwitz currently, like in present day, and it's a bunch of people vacuuming and cleaning and polishing the exhibit.
It's like they're opening the museum for the day.
Right.
Yeah.
So what did either of you make of this? Like, what, first of all, why is this in here? What is it supposed to mean? And sort of like what does it add to the film in terms of this is a project, like an intellectual project?
It's a great question. Because I think it's very complicated. I've had a bunch of thoughts, and so I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to sort of go into them. I sort of took it as like the first time and that he ever looked at the possibility that he won't be the hero. Like, it's the first time that he is seeing the trajectory of history where they lose, and what like he did is looked at as not like a monument to a great project that was successfully done by the good, pure master race, but instead this horrific, terrible thing. And so it's not necessarily that he's looking and being like, oh my God, like I shouldn't have done that. But he's looking at like, oh, like I may lose. Like I may be like, not even that I'm wrong, but just that I'm going to lose. And that like, that was my initial sort of take on it. I also feel like there's something interesting about how like it's all about cleaning. Like it's setting up the day, it's vacuuming, and it's wiping down the displays of, you know, the piles of shoes, and I think it's like, you know, one of the boxcars behind museum glass, or maybe it's other clothes, I forget. But that there's something about, even in the attempts to show how awful all of this was, it's still kind of tidied up compared to what actually happened. Like it's like it's almost like, in a weird way, it almost felt like it's acknowledging the limits of the movie by acknowledging the limits of the museum, of just like it was all worse. It was all worse than you could possibly have imagined. And we're just doing the best we can to tell you about it. And even in doing so, it's sanitized for you to be able to take in what's going on. Like you, the audience, not you, Rudolph, the character.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. Those were my two sort of conflicting thoughts about it. Greg, what did you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. That answer resonates with Marty at the end of Killers of the Flower Moon, right? In some ways, and so that's really of interest to me, and not exactly how I'd seen it, though. Though it's pretty convincing as a read. Jen, I'm going to throw it to you with the question of: did the character see it, or is it just a cut? So, but not right now.
Right.
Just save it. Start thinking about that. I think this is the biggest swing in a film full of really crazy, surprising moments. And my read on it was slightly different than PT's, because I think my initial impulse is thinking that the character realizes that, oh my God, this wasn't about getting the promotion. This wasn't about impressing my superiors. This was about something horrifying. And the fact that you've committed these atrocities at a level that there will be museums to you someday and to the atrocity you committed is really like a horrifying thought, right? Like, you're not just a little evil. Like, all of humanity will band together to create a museum to your evilness and your depravity. But that was, my initial thought. And then the second layer is that the cleaning becomes so prominent. And I will say, I like PT's read of the cleaning as the act of cleaning. In the theater, I thought about how mundane it was, right? That even in the kind of like, you are doing, and I use this word specifically but carefully, which is, you are doing great deeds, impactful deeds, right? Horrifying, awful things, but things that will be remembered. And yet, even the greatest atrocities you can imagine are eventually going to be minimum wage workers cleaning the glass around them in some ways, right? So kind of in that language PT was using, it's like, you are going to win in the moment, win in quotes, but the long arc of history is that you're going to lose. And I think that, to me, is a really interesting question, because it could have been school children seeing these exhibits, right? And that would have been impactful in a very different way. But it wasn't. It was how much work goes into how much kind of simple, mundane work, and how familiar these monuments to the atrocities become. And so the last piece I'll fold into that is, I think that the majority of people, if we're so far past those survivors of the Holocaust, there are some still with us, and their stories have been told, and so on. But the majority of the audience, I would say, has to have experienced the Holocaust through some sort of mediated experience like this. And so I do think it's a way to draw us back in as well, right? Not in that kind of complicit way, like I mentioned before, but just to remember that, like, you knew this story, right? And this is in line with what PT was saying. Like, you knew it, but you didn't know it, right? Like, you this is the version you know, and now we've shown you, like, yeah, you see the giant pile of shoes. I've been to the Holocaust Museum here in the States a few times. It's like, you see the pile of shoes and you're like, that's crazy. That's a lot of shoes. And like, you don't really think about the way those were taken, and who took them, and why they took them, and what feet were they on. It's like, the immensity of it you can't handle. So the last point I'll make in reading the scene is, I did hear the director not explain his exact reasoning, but note that he was very careful not to have him vomit. And the reason is because it is dry heaving, like you said. It's like he's starting to come to realize this, but he still stifles it all down, because that's what evil does. You still project that you are in control and the good guy. So that this wasn't a, oh my God, what have I done moment. This was a, oh, just never mind, back to business type moment. So what have we missed, Jen? And or what do you think? Did the character see these things in kind of a literal sense, or is it something else?
So first I'll say is that what I love about this is there are so many things you can take away from it, which I think is why it's so brilliant. I didn't initially think of it as, even though if we think about the editing of it, because he's looking and then it immediately cuts, it implies that he's kind of like having a thought, or whatever we see next is sort of what he is thinking or seeing somehow. But I sort of more interpret it as like, isn't kind of the whole point of this movie that we think of this as this major historical travesty, but he doesn't think of it really at all. You know what I mean? Like, that this is just him doing his job. And actually, the alternative reading, because I also thought about all the things that both of you said, but the alternative reading, I think, of him dry heaving to me was because we show him getting a checkup, or the film shows him getting a checkup a few scenes earlier, and the doctor's like, does everything seem normal, right? And he's just like, yeah, whatever, no problems, no complaints. And then clearly he's like, something is wrong with his body, right? And I feel like part of that was, throughout the film, we have so many moments of like toxicity, like environmental and physical toxicity, as a result of them, which I think is very, is a metaphor or a stand-in for the moral toxicity of this, right? But I think to me, it was sort of like his body even can't even deny the horrors of what he's doing, but his brain, because he sucks it back down, right, and moves on with his life, it's so easy for him to sort of to ignore it, right, and to not think about it in that way, and not be like, I wonder why I feel terrible. Maybe it's because I'm doing these terrible things and living in a place where thousands of people's bodies are being burnt and turned into ash and smoke, right? And I'm breathing that in and ingesting it every day. And so that was the other reading that I had, was the whole point is that film form dictates that is what he's thinking about, but it's not what he's thinking about at all, right? And then the other thing I thought about it in terms of the cleaning, and I mentioned this in my very short letterbox review, because it was very late at night by the time I wrote it when I got home from the movie, was never has domesticity been so weaponized. And I feel like so much of the power of this film is the constant cleaning and household chores, the gardening, all of the things that we associate with just everyday life, and knowing what that was all working towards, and then to see that in this other context almost is to say it hasn't stopped, right? To be like, this museum is still kind of profiting off the tourism of people going to visit it, and they're still working hard every day to keep it clean, keep it maintained. But it, and so to me, it was like to me, I read it as a parallel of like, we've been seeing so many images in this, that were horrifying, of just this family trying to keep their house clean and live a quote unquote good life, and like the Fuhrer said, right, that they should, and like, and so many wars have been waged in the name of the nuclear family and of protecting your family and a way of life, right? That I feel like that was kind of the film drawing both of the past and the present together in that specific context. And like, and also like the emotional distance between how we consume, because it's also a huge contrast between the way that we've been watching this family live their life kind of in the corner and in the shadows and very voyeuristically, to suddenly be in the context where there's a wall of glass between us and what's happening. That seems very purposeful as well, to be like, look, like the only way we can process this right now, and this is what the film is actively trying to work against, is this kind of like critical distance, as opposed to immersion, which I think is the project of the film. So yeah.
And I liked a lot of those points, and the things that you were saying were bouncing in my mind off of one of the things that Greg referenced earlier, which was the way that we saw the servants in the house for the duration of the movie as, and that they're prisoners of the camp, and they're trying to sort of, we stay to the side, we stay quiet. This is how we stay safe by, like they ask for something, I got to run and do it. And like really trying to just always disappear as much as possible into the sides. Like, isn't that also what, as you were saying, Greg, like minimum wage laborers, the people who come in and clean, the people who pick our foods, the people who, clean up around in all the places where we are. Like, isn't that also sort of how they feel they have to be now, to sort of continue to draw those parallels between then and now, and sort of, what are the inhumane things that are happening these days, and where are the spaces where maybe we should be reflecting on how we're treating fellow human beings?
So the other big thing I wanted to ask about was, and I think somebody mentioned this earlier, maybe it was Greg, the soundscape, the blank screen. I believe there are 3 total. 2, I think I counted 2 black and 1 red. I think the red one's in the middle. But this and I was listening to the big picture, and apparently Chris Ryan thought that the projector was broken.
I recall thinking something similar about like, this seems intentional, but like, are we sure this is what's supposed to happen?
Right. And I think it was Sean Fennessy, very elegantly recontextualize it as like, this is the film explicitly trying to draw attention to its choices and to itself as a project. And so because it's purposely pulling you out of the immersive story and what we're seeing, the slice of life every day, it's purposely pulling you out to get you to sort of think about it. I think is what was his explanation. But like, what do you feel like the effect or the purpose potentially of those moments are, where there's no image and there is sound?
Well, I want to give credit to the way Greg was describing it when he spoiled the movie in the non-spoiler section. But no, I think that's right, where it feels like we're entering into the artifice of the movie, where we're shifting perspectives, we're shifting to a different world. That felt like a right explanation of how the opening and the ending was. I forget, am I wrong in thinking that like in the ending it was a white screen and not a black screen? I saw it the furthest to go, so I could be wrong. I thought one of them was a white screen, which
that's
then
very possible.
Black, red, and white also tracks for the flag of
true.
The Nazis. But
I just remember the first one's definitely black. I think the middle one's red. I question mark about the last one.
Yeah, the middle one is red, and I'm curious what Greg thinks. My memory is it's the only time I felt like it was a jump scare, because it like cut to the red and the music came in really loud, and I was like very startled because it had been this very sort of deliberate pace and horrifying and just eating away at you, but like there was not a lot of quick movements or anything, and this was a drastic shift. And I recall sort of once I sort of settled from it being like, I don't know if I like this. And I also, in the moment, I also didn't know if I liked the infrared vision stuff, which is on our list and has been referenced. So I don't remember like coming to a real conclusion as to why the red screen is there or what happens right before and right after. So I'm going to set up Greg to see if he has an answer to that question. I don't know if he does.
Well, I mean, I do agree with the thought that, well, and I did already say my thoughts on the opening one, but the opening one is also disorienting in a very productive way, right? The way I was sitting there, and it wasn't a totally full theater, but there was a gentleman like 2 seats behind me who, man, gave the loudest harumphs as each trailer started past the second one. Like, harumph! What are they expecting us to do? And I'm like, sit here and wait through the trailers. This is AMC, my friend. Like, it's 25 minutes every time, no matter what. So kind of, I felt that disorientation. I needed to like leave this gentleman behind, and it's gonna sound cliche and cheesy, but like essentially leave my corporeal self behind and just give myself over to this film that, I was tired, and I probably shouldn't have eaten a giant plate of chicken fingers before running across the common to get there. And it's like I needed that disorientation to like really settle into the experience I was about to have. The later ones, I would lump the infrared in with this. I found them primarily as kind of pressure valves, that anytime I felt like I was getting overwhelmed, there would be this little bit of disorientation to give me permission to detach from all the emotions I was feeling. And Jen, when you were describing kind of the puzzle side of some parts of this movie, I think that also has that effect, that you start to use a different part of your brain and you get that little bit of release. And as overwhelming as I found all the film to be, I imagine without kind of those little breaks that it would have been much, much worse. I want to bookmark that. I really want to rant for a minute about the sound design in general, but I don't want to derail this point. So do you have anything to add?
That's sort of what I was setting up. So go for it.
So I really strongly recommend, if you have not gotten or if you have gotten this deep into the podcast, I really want to recommend actually a podcast my wife sent me, which is Slate, the online magazine, has a podcast called Working, which is about kind of experts in fields talk about their jobs. And this is one of the places the sound designer went for his campaigning. He also went on Big Picture. He's been around and largely gives the same message. But I just want to shout out, if people have not heard one of these interviews, the depth of detail in the sound is incredible. I think all of us would say we left the theater kind of clear on the fact that a lot of the movie was happening in the audio track and the way in which that audio was present and not present at times. But I just want to say that the incredible accuracy of the sound design will astound you. And it started by going to every narrative of a survivor or a victim that they could get their hands on, any narrative of somebody who was at Auschwitz. And they went line by line through the diary and found these sounds that they said. So the hum of the ovens is as close as they could get to describing what these journals said, down to the level that when we hear gunshots and a scream or something like that, the sound designer knows the specific event that is and the date it occurred and have mapped it down to that level. So there's no reason for that. You can do this and have the same effect without that level of detail, but it was clear they took it as a kind of moral charge to not exaggerate, not make this, just noise. Sorry, literally, but to really try to find dimensions of the experience that weren't being told. And that totally changed my mind about like so much in this film that, Jen, you pointed out before, everything is so intentional here. And it's like, of course they would go to that detail and they would build that. And that's why it was on my BAFTA ballot for best sound. It's for me the Oscar frontrunner, even if it's not going to be what the prognosticators are saying. So I'll stop ranting there, but really seek out him in any interview because it's completely blown me away and been one of those things that really stuck with me that like, if he took this job, or there are multiple, if they took it this seriously, I mean, I didn't even get into it. The guns are the real guns. Like they went to museums and found the pieces that would be fired and found historical firearms. And it's like, it's not going to just be a gunshot. It's going to be that gun fired in that way into that place. It's mind blowing. So now I really.
Wow. That's incredible. Thanks for sharing. I had no idea about any of that. And now I'm like, their campaign's dropping the ball because like while he's doing all these interviews, because I'm basic, I'm like, where is this on my Instagram feed? Because there's so many behind the scenes and like maybe that would be bad and we don't want that. So, you know what I mean? Like I kind of get why maybe, but at the same time, all the other Best Picture nominees have their makeup artists, their costumes, like all of the craftspeople are out there having behind the scenes reels on the internet. Like
I've seen the creator visual effects reel like 20 times. I'll watch it 20 more, but yeah, it's everywhere all of a sudden. Whereas, you're not seeing that in the same way.
All right. I think we are ready because I'm looking ahead to Rhetorical Situation and I'm seeing we can continue our discussion of the sound because I was sort of waiting for us to get to this because like to me this is the big thing with the movie. I feel like those pressure valve breaks that as you described in the Greg are to make sure if you wrote Auschwitz the soundscape as just being in the background, no, we're gonna make you sit with it so you can realize, if you haven't already, to realize what those sounds actually are. You know what I mean? And I feel like a lot of critics that I've listened to have said that those were the places they were like, oh, those are the ovens. You know what I mean? Like, or like there's a moment of a realization, whereas your brain sometimes maybe is just like, oh, that's just background noise. Like, right. Like if they pull away the visual and the image, then it's much easier to realize what all those sounds are. But anyway, so I think, we're going to go into Rhetorical Situation, a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experience. So, in the teaching of writing, rhetorical situation refers to any contextual factors that influence composing and interpretation. We like doing this segment because all four of us who are regular co-hosts on the show are academics, are writing teachers in some capacity. And so we always like to have a space to deliberately sort of make connections between these two worlds that we occupy. Who wants to start? We have a lot of juicy stuff in here.
PT, I just ranted. It's all you.
You did, but it was such a good rant that I want to give you like full credit for it. I guess this is what I'm interested in, because we're so positive on this. There are a bunch of negative perceptions of this movie, from not just from people who were like, I can't engage with it, or I found it boring or whatever, but there are folks who just sort of saw it as like, yeah, I get it. Like, okay. And I'm thinking particularly Richard Brody in the New Yorker, Mahola Dargis in the New York Times, were both sort of like, this is cheesy. Like, this is, I think, hollow kitsch is the phrase that Richard Brody used. That was just sort of like, like, it's playing off of what we know. Like the fact that it's always on the margins is almost like a bit to sort of be like, haha, like we're gonna keep you from like actually looking at this. But it's ultimately this sort of, the mundanity of it isn't horrifying. It's just kind of boring and is kind of like, no, like what we know, like the people who ran the concentration camps were terrible, and I guess their families were terrible too. Like, again, maybe like 10 minutes is all I needed. A short film would have been fine. I guess I'm curious, like, is like, we don't feel that way. Like, what do we say? What do we say in response to that? Is that just, yeah, I guess this didn't resonate with you? And it, I don't think it's an unfair reading. I do feel like it's, I guess I don't know what the disconnect is of why it was so impactful for all three of us, but there are very smart, very, non-evil people who are just sort of like, oh, like, no, this was whatever. I wasn't into this.
So there's two slightly different things kind of embedded in this. I think one is, this is not a narrative feature in the traditional sense. I think that's part of it, is that, and I don't think this for all the things we've just talked about that this movie has accomplished and evoked, I don't think that happens if it is shot and cut in the manner of a traditional feature film with like shot reverse shots and stuff like, I just don't think it works as well in that way. And or the screenplay, if the screenplay is like, we're really rooting for Hedwig and Rudolph to get back on track and get their marriage back on track, like if there's something like that, I feel like it just brings that, it like totally undermines everything this film was trying to do. So I think I get that if you are wanting it to be a more narrative film and to have more of a traditional character development, story arc, stuff like that, I get craving that and missing that, but just go watch other movies. You know what I mean? Like, I think what this film intellectually is trying to do is so special that I'm willing to overlook any sort of like, you know what I mean? Any quote unquote shortcomings that it has on that front in terms of not mapping onto traditional Hollywood cinema. Like, so I think there's that. And then the other thing, which is slightly different, I think, is the idea that you mentioned, where it's like, why is this not a short film? Why does it? I heard this from lots of critics that didn't care for it, where they were like, why are we just repeating the same idea over and over again? The counter argument I heard a lot of other critics say when they kind of like entertain this criticism was that every time it is repeated, there's a slightly different angle on it. But even if you don't think that, I feel like part of the point is the repetition, that it's everyday life, and that for these particular people, this is just how they were living. You know what I mean? And like, and they saw value in that, and it wasn't an extraordinary event to them, right? And so I feel like, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like the themes and what this film is trying to achieve can easily explain away any of these criticisms. Whether or not that means you shouldn't have those criticisms, I'm not saying that, but like, to me, that's why it works. Because there's clearly purpose behind these choices.
It really makes me think about the movie I was afraid this would be. And I know you just mentioned these smart critics who did definitely watch the movie, but it's like, I was afraid that, I'm actually, this is so dumb. I'm thinking of Amy March in Gerwig's Little Women, when she says writing about something confers importance, right? Amy Demption, 2021. I forget when that movie came out. But I think there was a fear that focusing on this family at Auschwitz would glorify them, just in purely in the act of focusing would elevate them and redeem them in some way. And I think the film is at great pains, and we've been over the litany of evidence that this is not glorifying them. And yet, as I alluded to at one point, like the way we are used to consuming film, our sympathies go to them. And that's where the real work of this film is happening, is in that gap between where we think our affections are and where they should be. And that is really kind of upsetting in a positive way, right? And so I don't, having seen the film and how it really avoids that, I don't understand these critics that are saying that. Now, the criticism Jen brings up about, like, yeah, you could have gotten this in 10 minutes. Guys, I'm telling you, the live action shorts this year are brutal. They make a very strong political point many times in like 20 minutes, but they feel just that much more superfluous. And I respect this film for being like, no, you sit in this and you feel this, and you don't get just 10 minutes. You don't get a YouTube or a TikTok. You have to actually sit in this and these feelings and work to unpack them. And that is such a powerful, part of this experience to me. So I will shift that into one of our other topics here, which is thinking about, like, why now? Why is this film coming out in 2024, and what does it have to say to now? Because so much of the rhetorical situation as we teach it, we often in rhetoric and composition boil this down to intent and impact, right? That there's often a gap there. You control the context in which you create a piece of writing. You don't control the context in which it's received. In this particular case, there's some world events that complicate some feelings for some people, and I think a lot of people have struggled with how that should or should not impact your interpretation of this film or this part of history. But I will just kick it off before throwing it over to PT and say that I feel like this is much more concerned with the rise of fascism today than any critics who dismiss it seem to really understand. And I think that is probably, to me, the reason it deserves its Best Picture nomination, despite all the things we're talking about.
Jonathan Glazer has said that's why he made this film.
Okay.
Is to specifically use this history to comment on our present problems in the rise of fascism and how easy it is for that to happen again. Because by exposing that they're just really going about their everyday lives, no big deal, right? Like, to be like, look how easy it is for them, right? And therefore easy for other people who may or may not be facilitating that today.
They are facilitating it. But I think that, I think that the people who, I not to belabor about the critics who didn't like the movie, but it feels like the people who have well thought out, strong opinions of, like, that didn't rate this movie particularly highly. It's either a combination of, I have been thinking about the rise of fascism for, as long as Jonathan Glazer has been trying to make this movie, which is a decade. He was reading, a draft of the book before the book was published in 2014. So, or at least he was aware of it and was talking to Martin Amis about it. So, he took a decade working on it. And some of the people are like, yeah, I've been thinking about it all that time too. Like, I don't need this, which I think is a bit of cognitive egocentricity of, like, well, guess what? A whole lot of other people do. So, maybe it's not a bad thing that this is a prominent movie that's going to maybe get people to think about, oh, how much am I letting myself just sort of get fixated on what I'm doing in my life and letting things unfold around me that are bad, or even, like, allowing it to happen, like, making active choices that are perpetuating a shift in this direction. Or there's people who kind of feel like this is such a important, for lots of different reasons and all the sort of factors around it. The Holocaust is a particular and unique thing, that setting it up as this is a parallel to the rise of things that are happening now is insulting to the victims of, like, what was happening then. And I kind of, I don't feel like I saw that ever explicitly stated, but that felt like the people who were like, complaining about this movie, and complaining seems like a loaded word, but critiquing this movie for in a similar way that people were critiquing Oppenheimer, of you're not showing the victims, like you're just showing these people who were setting it up, and that is removing sort of the reality of it. Now, I think, again, like in thinking of a wider context, there's no shortage of movies, like you were saying earlier, there's no shortage of movies you could go and watch if you want to look at victims of the Holocaust. That's why this is a unique and interesting story of just looking at that house on the outskirts. It's the thing that's usually in the background of the Auschwitz scenes is the foreground, and Auschwitz itself is the background. So yeah, I think that is, I think that's both important, and I do think it's, it's why it feels so. I think why it feels so bad for people to watch it now is the ways in which it's just kind of like, yeah, like I can, I could see someone doing something like this, again, not like I think very few people would think like, yes, that would be great. I would love to have that house and do that job. But there are things that are, not that far removed from it, that people are not that far away from, that, it's like, oh, if I got that promotion, like, wouldn't that be great? And not thinking about the collateral damage, I guess, of the lives that we're living in, the society we're building.
Greg, you had a really good note in here about foreground and background. Do you want to jump in and talk about it?
I do, Jen. So one of the things I studied, sorry, I didn't have an Oompa Loompa rhyme ready to go. So one of the things that I studied a bit in grad school is become a popular kind of metaphor is the idea of the palimpsest. And I'm going to do my best to explain this, even though I have always felt like I barely understood it. But the literal palimpsest is the fact that for centuries, in order to create paper, they would take old paper that was discarded and essentially mash it up and steam it and dye it and put it together. And so scholars of literature and rhetoric will often be able to see in a text that has been preserved the shadows or the fragments of a text that was purposefully not preserved. And this has become a metaphor for how in literature and rhetoric, how there is kind of the version of things that is meant to be presented, and then the version that still comes through. And we in grad school, Jen, I don't even know if you heard this paper, but we had a colleague named Danielle who wrote a brilliant paper that was specifically about the ship logs that the captains would keep aboard slaver ships, and how that log was purely about commerce. And that's the whole idea. The kind of brutality of slavery is the fact that it was all just about numbers and economies, right? And so those captains would keep that, but they would sometimes write down about how there was a great bellowing under the decks, or that the slaves got rowdy once there was a song. And there's a way in which those people have been lost to history, but their voice carries through as a palimpsest, right? That we wanted to ignore the humanity of those people, and their voices did come through. And we know they sang songs below the decks, and we know they shouted out and so on. And I thought of that so much in this movie, because what we are presented with in the foreground is the systematic way in which all of this was supposed to be silenced. It was all going to be the master narrative of the master race is going to be the new history. And the control of language, the control of identity, all of that is folded into the violence of the genocide. And so I thought, in all the previous rant I gave about the sound was exactly reenacting that same thing. It was, you maybe are trying to control this. And this is you in that sense is, I think, the characters, and in some ways the filmmakers, right? Like, this is supposed to be a narrative that is constructed in a particular way. but it's not, right? And you both have spoken really well about the mother character, and the mother character is exactly that, right? She's affected by the palimpsests. She sees the narrative that is being suppressed, and that fragment comes through and affects her, and she's, you know, essentially the most moral character I think we have presented in the film in many ways. That might be going too far.
Well, everything's relative. So,
yeah, true.
So relative to the other characters.
Certainly the most moral of the family. Like, yes. I mean, I don't want to speak to the other people.
But
yes.
the comment that PT brought up earlier, where she talks about, I wonder if the woman whose house I used to clean is on the other side. That indicates that maybe this is not even a moral repulsion. You know what I mean? Again, this goes back to the end scene with the commandant dry heaving. It's like it's purely a physical one, which is sort of like the palimpsest for the mental one, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like they're all fine with this.
It's the abstract versus the concrete, where it's just sort of like, like, oh, we have to conquer the West in America, but it's like no one's thinking about like, and here are the people that are dead because of that, and like looking at like the people, you know, being murdered or piled up somewhere, or, you know, put into a reservation, you know, and actually looking at that is like, oh no, I don't like that. Like, I like conquering the West, but I don't like the actual work of it. I don't like the outcome. I certainly don't want to see it. Like, I don't think that the character of the grandmother left to then try to agitate for this to stop. She just left to not have to look at it anymore.
That's a really good point.
So I'll close my rant part 2 by just saying I think the museum folds into this really well, and I think we've covered that ground, so I won't repeat it. But then you think about the museum as yet another narrative trying to pull the story of the victims, the fragments out, and all we're left with is the shoes and the suitcases and the boxcar, the physical objects that are what remains afterwards. And when we've problematized those scenes tonight by adding in the cleaners, that becomes almost another version of that when we tell the story of the museum, we actually lose the story of the labor that keeps the museum welcoming guests. The people doing the actual work of keeping this presentation, you know, in a form we can all see, are erased, and they all shuffle out before the gates open. And I think that is another reminder of who gets to be a part of the story that gets controlled and gets shared. So it's a really fun kind of cocktail party academic term. I encourage people to just rip off anything I've said out loud and, you know, use it at your cocktail party. But it's a helpful way to think again about the ways in which history is constructed. And I think we could have had the same conversation at Killers of the Flower Moon too, really.
For sure. And I think the last thing I'll add on to that, because it's really driving home this point that I already had in our notes, was that Marx very famously defines history as the means of production. And I feel like there's so many moments in this film that reminded me of that. A bunch Greg just talked about. But the one scene we haven't really mentioned that kind of fits into everything we're saying here is the board, like kind of the boardroom meeting where Rudolph is like reporting to everyone else in his new position. And so much of that discussion is sort of like the ship logs, like, oh, we're just trying to ramp up production. The crematorium is basically just a way to increase efficiency. And because the really horrifying thing at the beginning of the film, when they're being shown the blueprints and like basically being pitched on this particular model of a crematorium, is the guy says, and it never has to stop. Like, it's like it keeps rotating. Like there's something about the engineering of it where it's like it just keeps, it's like a revolving, like a like a sushi conveyor belt. Like it just keeps going. That's a terrible comparison. But and so much of that discussion is purely about here's just how we economize all of this stuff. And so with Rudolph as a character, he's really only thinking about and his conversation where they decide he's going to move, but the rest of the family won't, is Hedwig sort of calls him out and says, like, this is what you've been working for, is for us to have this kind of life, right? Like, And so everything that he's doing with Auschwitz is purely to help his family get ahead. And the conversation with the mother, Hedwig's mother, reinforces that, where she's like, you've really done well for yourself. Like, and it's like, the fact that she's saying that so sincerely is insane. Like, you know what I mean? But that's what it comes down to, is that this is so easy to happen because everyone's so focused on their capitalist gains, right? And they're not thinking about the larger context in which that's what that's contributing to, essentially, right? But yeah,
it's all their own benefits and not the costs incurred by anyone else.
Yeah. Yes. Well said. All right. So I do want us to get to quick Oscars watch. We will have a full Oscar predictions episode coming up fairly soon in 2 parts, because it's impossible to cover it even in one of our extra long episodes. So we don't have to dwell on this a ton, because I'm sure we'll talk about it again on those episodes. But what are we thinking in terms of, well, I guess I'll put this fraught relationship with this music every time. It's never gonna get old. So Oscars, what? Yeah, just because I don't have a tagline prepared, I'm just like, let's just start talking about the Oscars. But yeah, this is Oscars watch, in this case, in which we speculate about what zone of interest can win. Again, seems really weirdly inappropriate to be playing.
I think Marks would approve of that. He'd be like, great. That's
true. That's true. Okay, so Zone of Interest is nominated for 5 categories: Best Picture, Best Director. This just really keeps going.
It's like it's a full track almost.
It's like those Best Picture nominees. It just keeps going.
Just keep going. So the Zone of Interest is nominated for Best Picture, Director, Adapted Screenplay, International Feature, and Sound. Which of these is it winning?
I mean, it's the front runner for International Feature, and I feel like the BAFTA momentum, is that a term? It is
now.
Push it to, for even closer to having that locked up. I feel like the movie that would have been the biggest competitor for it I guess Society of the Snow is up there. That's right. So maybe Society of the Snow, just because I feel like that had a moment, but I think that moment passed. Perfect Days, maybe, like, because that's just came out. But I think that's pretty easily locked up, and I'm with BAFTA and I'm with Greg. Give me a button for I'm with Greg. But I think this deserves Sound. The presumption has been that's one of those Oppenheimer ones. I think we may have said that earlier in the BAFTA discussion, but yeah, it would be great. I think it would be really worthwhile, not just because of all the work and accuracy that I also had not heard about, but it's great to hear. And I'm going to want to seek out some of those interviews. But just how important it is for the impact of the movie, and how it, it doesn't just sort of say there's bad things happening nearby, but just generates the unease and really, even the scenes that are away, there's very few, but when Rudolph is transferred, and I forget what's the city he goes to, but when he's off in the city and he's not, by the camp itself, there's still so many interesting choices and moments in the sound design. I hope it wins.
How about you, Greg?
I'm all in on sound. I will print the buttons, but I think there's real hope for it, because I think about sound engineers who understand the level of work. And that's no disrespect to Oppenheimer, but in Oppenheimer, it feels like that's everything is great about your movie, including the sound award, whereas this would be a sound is really important here. I'm just going to be completely honest. I completely forgot Anatomy of a Fall was blanked by France. So when PT started talking, I'm like, what are you talking about? Of course it's going to lose to Anatomy of a Fall. And then I was like, oh, of course. So I get to just tug on my collar and brag that I have now watched all of these international features, and it is a very strong category this year. I just want to recommend that if people don't dig into these, it's a tough category. I would even myself put Society of the Snow kind of lower because I think the other ones are really, really powerful. Io Capitano is like Lawrence of Arabia style film creation and narrative. It's like unbelievably big and special. It's crazy that it's Italian because I think the film is all in French and set all in Tunisia, or maybe it's Algeria. Algeria. Anyway, it's like not at all Italian. Like, don't go in being like, can't wait to see some pasta or whatever. It's not going to get there. And I will say that personally, Teacher's Lounge is the most unsettling film I've seen in a very long time. Very much different than Zone of Interest, but also there. So, all that is just me rambling and bragging about movies I've seen. I hope this wins Best International Feature, and I'm glad to hear PT say it's the front runner since Anatomy of the Fall isn't here.
Yeah, I'm pretty much with you. I think, to me, if I'm thinking about this from my like Oscars puzzle perspective, typically if there's an international feature nominee that's also in Best Picture, that's the go-to winner. It's kind of happened every time in the past 5 to 10 years, and the fact that the international features are get nominated at all in Best Picture, that's a relatively new thing. So they've typically kind of gone hand in hand, right? So that one I'm pretty confident in. There was a time where I thought adapted screenplay could be a spoiler category just because of the Martin Amis novel. But here's the thing. Everyone's kind of saying that this film is much more notable as a directorial achievement, but Christopher Nolan has that locked up, so it's not winning there either. But that it's like not really, people aren't going to really be thinking about the screenplay necessarily. They're going to be thinking about the directing. So, and the sound and like all the things we've been talking about this whole episode. So sound, I think, is the only place where it's probably going to be one of those things where everyone, like 80% of people are predicting Oppenheimer, but then the few people who are like, I'm gonna bet on a weird upset here are gonna go with this for sound. And I think if we, and like at first I was like, oh, from a spreading the wealth perspective, it winning in sound makes a lot of sense. But if it's already a winning international feature, there's less of a case, I think, to be made for that. So I do feel like it will be sort of, if it does happen, in sound, it will be a spoiler.
It is just the sound people who vote for the sound award, right? That's one of those.
I mean, for the nominations, for sure.
Okay, so it might be everybody.
Everyone voted for everything now. Am I wrong about this?
It's your area of expertise more than mine. So
no, you're right. Yeah. Well,
I think it's for nominations that is true. The exception to that is animation now, which is more of a free for all.
During the finals, all Oscar categories are on the ballot for voting members.
Yeah, so I think everyone can vote.
The people who work in sound choose the nominees, and then everyone votes for everything, which is partly why you get those crazy, the people who get interviewed anonymously who are like, I didn't watch this movie more than 5 minutes. Like they could have been asked about their vote for sound. I don't think the Hollywood Reporter thinks anyone but us sickos really care about it. But yeah, I think that everyone can vote for it. So yeah, I mean, it is, I don't know. It to me feels possible. I think it's possible that Zone of Interest could win sound just because I think the movie is impressive. I think that more people have been seeing it and might be like, yes, I want to give it even more. I want it to win 2 Oscars instead of 1. And this is a place where it makes sense to vote for it. I think it almost kind of depends on, how strong is Oppenheimer? Is Oppenheimer such a big deal that it's just going to gallop through all the technical awards and, push Barbie out of the way, push Poor Things, and in this category, push Zone of Interest? If there's any, I don't want to say weakness, but if there's any sort of like, maybe Oppenheimer has enough, this does feel like a place where something else could get in, and I think it would be Zone of Interest.
Counterpoint is sound and editing historically go hand in hand, especially when they're being won by the Best Picture winner. So
Fair.
If Oppenheimer's taking it, having a big night, and it's like not a question of whether, but how much. I feel like sound probably gets swept up with editing, because editing seems pretty locked for Oppenheimer right now, I would say. But yeah.
And I think that you're right that it never really had any momentum in adapted screenplay, but I just want to say I wish it did. Like, all due respect, I'm happy American Fiction, it looks to be on a path to win an award, or that Barbie looks on a path to get an Oscar to Greta and Noah Baumbach. But I would also, I do feel like the fact that it by all accounts is it's only taking one little like sliver of the book and expanding it out. Like that's, I always think is one of the best forms of adaptation. And so I think that would have been very successful. And even though it is so visual and it is so audio, that like the structure of it was still needed to be there for it to work. So would have been cool if it was sort of even had a chance, a puncher's chance in the race. But all due respect to the other movies, I'm happy if either of them win as well.
Watch Zone of Interest win PGA, and then everyone's confused. You know what I mean? Like I hope something like that happens, just to throw chaos and spice things up, so that the Long March of Oppenheimer, which I would be completely happy if it won all the things we think it's going to win. But I think that would be really fun, because PGA nominating Zone of Interest already threw people into a tizzy, where they were like, this is like the least PGA type movie ever, because PGA tends to be more mainstream, more blockbuster. And then the fact that they included this movie in their 10, people were like, what is going on? So who knows? We'll see. All right. I think that's good. And as I said, we have a lot more Oscars talk on the way. So I think we can end there. Greg, where can folks find you and all of your great work on the internet?
Thanks for letting me come in and talk about just a fantastic movie. It was really fun to be back on, and thank you so much. Let's see. You can find most of my writing by going to eyeoncanon.com. I also host a weekly podcast about the Wheel of Time called Through the Glass Columns. I am this week returning to my co-hosting duties on Rebel Base Card's Bad Batch coverage, which means, yes, I'm spending more hours in my basement with a microphone than is healthy for any human being for the next 2 months. I did just want to shout out my letterbox is also Eyeon Canon, YEONCANON. PT and I are doing God's work trying to make the tag system on Letterboxd work, and we are tagging all our reviews with LTR Pod. Jen is as well, but she watches something called a healthy number of movies, as opposed to diving through 5 films every Saturday afternoon. So I encourage our listeners to seek us out there and tag your reviews with LTR Pod. And if PT and I can figure out how to search for them on occasion, we'll look for what our listeners are also posting about.
I appreciate that Greg is trying to both make the tag happen and he took up the mantle of trying to explain the tag and how it works. Because every time I try to do it, I'm like, there's a tag and you click, but there's a pull down menu and you got to choose everyone. But if you change the view, you got to change it to everyone again. It's a whole mess. So we're also calling on Letterboxd to improve the tags. I know they're listening.
And PT, where can folks contact us if they have alternate interpretations of everything that's going on in this film, or they just want to let us know that they accepted the challenge to go watch it?
Sure. Well, I mean, they can go and find any of our reviews on Letterboxd, as previously mentioned, tagged LTR Pod, and they can. I'll plug my Letterboxd on there, which is PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF. So you can go and try to add some comments on my review or either Jen or Greg's. You can also, as mentioned earlier, follow us on any of your podcast app feeds. Check out Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com, or contact us on Instagram or Threads at The Long Take Review. And if you don't want to talk to us in any sort of a public setting, you can email us thelongtakereview@gmail.com.
You can find me at Qui-Gon Jen on Letterboxd and at Subchokchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram and Threads. Thank you both. for reinforcing how much I appreciated this movie, but then also helping me understand it better. Thanks for listening. You can follow The Long Take Review on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive new podcast episodes, as well as written reviews of films with Oscar buzz and new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.